we'll start with where we left off, which was barriers to self-care. And so thinking about, even if we have sort of the greatest plan, right, for self-care and what we'd like to do for ourselves, what gets in the way? And this may not come as a surprise, but the first kind of major hurdle is actually asking for help. And that requires, kind of knowing your limitations, knowing what your needs are, and who you might ask, right? Because you won't feel comfortable even moving in that direction if you feel like there's really no one that you can trust, right? So let's start with that. If I can get okay. So the first question that I want you all to think about is, what do you risk when you ask for help? Right? What is something that is either a fear or just sort of the first thought that comes to mind when you think about that? And anyone can chime in.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What do you risk when you ask for help?
That the need won't be met.
Right. Right. What else?
People won't care.
That
So I think that brings up another thought that came up for me, because I remember you put this question up. For me, I've had a history of encountering very spiritually abusive people in my lifetime. So when I found myself in a position as an imam, chaplain, in communities or in work, I find myself very apprehensive about asking for help for fear that people would feel obligated because of my position or because of who I am. And, so I tend to really stay away from asking for help anywhere within what I consider to be my community or where my authority is. So that has its challenges.
Yeah. So then if you're apprehensive about asking for help from the community that you're in, sort of what does that leave? What pool of resources does that leave you?
Employee assistance programs.
Okay. And
which is a good resource, by the way.
Oh no, absolutely, absolutely. It's often not used, to its full extent. But I think that's right. That it's easier said than done, right? When someone says, "Oh, just let me know if you need anything," just give me a call or text, or just reach out. I think there's an assumption that one, in the moment, you know what you need. And that you are also confident that the other person who can sort of meet it. And so the risk, I think, associated is often tied to fears from the past about being disappointed, about being rejected, about perhaps being belittled, or your need minimized to some extent. And so we risk, vulnerability. And the possibility that what is really important to us and for our health won't be met with sort of the understanding and the empathy that we deserve. And so I gave you all this quiz. It was, I have a slide. I'll go back. No. Do you all have the handout? It was like asking for help and the kind of leader that you are. Let me see if I can find it. And if you haven't, a really good resource is this website, unstuck.com. Let's see if I can pull it up. Oh.
Was it the same as what's on the screen?
It should say what you would see is it says about what a lone leader is. If you chose mostly A answers, opaque leader, uneasy, hesitant leader.
Yeah, this handout is not familiar to me.
Let's see.
I don't remember that one.
Okay.
I don't remember seeing this in class.
Okay. You know what? I'll make sure I email it or I post it for you then. But essentially, there's a series. It's kind of like a really brief sort of self-assessment or quiz, and it has 3 different types of leaders, and those who are opaque, uneasy, and hesitant. And the opaque leader describes as, you want everyone to think that you have it all figured out. And even when you don't quite feel as competent, a fear is that people will sort of minimize authority, right? Because you don't know all of the answers. And so as it says, like the questions might be, if you ask for help, will you still be respected, right? Would you lose your position? And so rather than chance it, you draw the shades around your weak spots and carry on like the impenetrable expert you believe you should be. And often that should around expertise may have you pretending, right? And instead of saying, can someone fill me in, or I'm not really sure about this, then, we pretend. And that's where we really get ourselves in trouble often. And so you need to see how asking for help is a sign of confidence, and never saying you're sorry. And not saying, I'm wrong, I have to find this, but, I need more information, and the courage to request assistance lets people see your human side. And I think, again, it's the aspect of vulnerability that people really, really struggle with. And the uneasy leader says you're happiest when things are on a steady simmer and within reach. That way you can adjust as needed to ensure good results. It's when you can't fully control the situation that misgivings arise. So will someone else make the same decision you would? Will quality suffer? And so being a little bit uneasy about the certainty of your own ability. So think about asking for help as a way to make things better. And then finally, the hesitant leader is you keep the wheels turning almost single-handedly without much need for applause. The thing is, when you could use some assistance, you're reluctant to sound the alarm. Will they think I'm a pest? Will they have bigger fish to fry? Again, that goes back to, do I believe that people will care, right, enough and feel a sense of urgency in providing the assistance? Or will no one answer at all when I say I need help? Like, you finally muster up the courage and ask for help, and there's like deafening silence. I mean, is anything more anxiety provoking than, you finally saying like, yeah, I think I'm going to ask for help. And you put out the call and there's silence, right? And so there it's really holding on to the belief that people want to help. And the difficult part of it might be simply, working up the courage to ask. Okay. So in this book here, Clergy Self-Care, these next few slides focus on the ideas, page 84, living in the tension. It's chapter 11.
Which book is that?
Clergy Self-Care by Roy Oswald. So living in the tension. And here what I have underlined is the understanding that much of the stress of ministry, and again, ministry in kind of a broad definition, comes from trying to resolve conflicts that cannot and should not be resolved, right? Some tension will remain. But if we think that everything has to be resolved and in a certain way at a particular time, then we sort of risk kind of going between being really vague and being really rigid. And so what he includes here is this idea of rigidity and flexibility, right? Across from each pole, he's saying there's sort of the opposite of each. So one example he gives is if someone is thought of to be a rigid person, you know, someone may say like, well, they're clear. I know exactly what they mean. I don't have to read their mind. They tell me exactly what they think. But on the other hand, someone who's deemed sort of vague or ambiguous for someone might be seen as flexible, right? Or willing to kind of hear other people out. And so the question, that we're trying to figure out is what is the appropriate balance between that rigidity and that flexibility, right? Between being very clear and also leaving room for possibility for other people to add kind of their input. So these are sort of essentially what Oswald is asking. How do we maintain some kind of balance between our service to others and our care for ourselves, right? Because often what people will say is that when I care for myself, that's time I'm taking away from someone who perhaps needs me more than I need myself is sort of essentially the question. But also thinking about what are all the things, right, in this upper left quadrant, what are all the things that would draw us into greater self-care? What are some of the negative consequences of being too deeply, right, involved in self-care? Does that mean now other things don't get sufficient attention because all of it is devoted to yourself? I mean, he talks about that as overindulgence. And then the cost of being overextended. So it's overindulging and then being overextended, right? So it's constantly living in that tension of trying to figure out how do I care for myself and care for others in the most balanced way. Okay, so these are some examples. And this is on page 86, okay? And this is what he described as sort of a composite of clergy responses and thinking about sort of what's healthy about self-care, right? You value yourself, you allow others to care for you. And then if you are overindulging in the practice, right? What he calls is idolatry of the body and health, right? So you start to kind of worship this idea of being very focused on yourself, which can maybe perhaps expand the ego in a way that you didn't anticipate, right? So it's always this balance, right? Meaning and purpose in life in terms of ministry to others. But if there isn't a balance, it can lead to burnout, right? And feeling exploited and abused by the people that you're in service to. So this sort of describes like what happens when we're trying to figure out what the good, the right mix of ingredients might be. And so what he describes is that, it'll fluctuate, right? You might go from very little self-care, right? And so on the far right side, you feel exhausted and cynical, disillusioned. And then the other side, if you're overindulging, then it leads to narcissistic behavior. On page 89, what that sort of figure depicts is, well, what happens when most of your activity falls in a more healthy range, right? Physical, emotional, spiritual health through good self-care practices, alongside effective ministry and compassion with others. Okay, so this is why I think the shape of the daily life activity allows you to sort of make those adjustments. Perhaps one day you devoted a lot of time to whatever capacity you're serving in, and you say, you know what, I spent about, say, 5 hours there. I'm going to make sure I carve out this time for my family or for myself, and I'm going to make sure that it's uninterrupted time, right? And so that sort of represents the flow of trying to always find that balance. Any questions about that? Okay. So here's the, so you haven't seen this?
No.
Okay. I'll make sure you all get this then. So thinking about how to get assistance you need but won't ask for. And so I'll send that to you all. You can kind of do your self-assessment.
This is actually one of the handouts you gave us.
Yes. This was one of the handouts. So in terms of even thinking about how to ask for the support, I think this is a good kind of quick way to assess where you generally fall. Do you sort of ask a question or ask for help in such a vague, roundabout way that people really may not even know that that's what you're asking for? But in your mind, you're like, well, see, I put it out there. Nobody came to my rescue. No one, kind of gave me what I needed, but perhaps your communication wasn't clear. So what you needed actually kind of went unaddressed. So we talked about this idea of, where your well is. Has anyone given any more thought to how you maintain your well or where your well is?
I actually have a question, Professor. As far as the well is concerned, I can see that a big part of my well is solitary. And I understand that there needs to be there needs to be a social element to it, and that's where I think I'm lacking or deficient in. And I wonder what your thoughts on as far as should there be a balance, or is that just something that may be specific to certain people?
Well, I think that, of course, what that balance looks like will depend on, to some degree, your personality, your temperament. But if you find that the need for or the tendency to be solitary is in some part due to avoiding, right, vulnerability, or avoiding the perception that you're dependent on others in a way that feels uncomfortable, then that's when you have to kind of push yourself just a little bit, right? Because sometimes being solitary or being alone becomes very comfortable. And we have to really sort of gauge whether or not the comfortability has to do with minimizing the potential for disappointment, perhaps. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, actually it does. It makes sense. But identifying perhaps the motivation behind leaning either way is a good way to gauge where I would be.
Yes.
On the spectrum.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
So can I add something or ask a question about something here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so for me, I feel like part of this it brings a little. I don't want to use the word anxiety, but I feel like it's something to accomplish. Sometimes it brings up like, okay, you need to make sure you have this balance, and you need to make sure, you know where your well is, and you need to make sure that like, just so. For me, what's been working is just accepting this idea that there is no day, for me, this is my reality, that's really pure balance. And like you mentioned earlier, it's more like, all right, you know what? I'm feeling this today and I really worked hard. I was at work, a couple extra hours. I can see my kids feel a little neglected or we had to eat out. So you know what? Tomorrow I'm going into work, a couple hours late. And I might leave early so I can go to the gym. I feel like it's this constant negotiating, because I don't think I've had a day where it's been like, it's always like, I'm feeling this. Okay, now I'm going to react to it. Does it get better than that? Is it always a reaction to how you're, it's always like, oh, I didn't realize this was happening. Now I realize this is happening. So I'm going to change this. But it's never like, for me at least right now, it's never like planned ahead of time. Does that happen? Where it's like, that's what I'd love to hear you talk about.
Yeah, no, I think that is probably true to many people's experience, right? And I like to think about it in terms of when you're driving, right? You make adjustments all the time without realizing it, right? Like, maybe you got distracted by one of the kids and you saw like maybe you were drifting too close to, the line. Maybe you turned up the radio or you turned it down. Like when you're driving, even though you're doing a major task, you're making adjustments along the way, like constantly. And so I see if it is approached as a to-do list, right? Like, okay, today, balance. That you're already out of balance, right? Because you're expecting that perfection will look like you being able to maintain a certain pace perfectly, right? And so it is more, the self-awareness is more about noticing where you have to sort of fine tune, right? And it is about, say, you're drifting more towards hours being spent doing work-related activities, right? And so in order to sort of like right the ship, so to speak, you are intentional also about saying, okay, how can I introduce, because that can start to become a gravitational pull, right? You spend long hours and you're like, well, I'll just be another half an hour, right? But that might be half an hour that you had delegated towards something else. And so I absolutely think it's sort of these series of adjustments and compromises and negotiations that we make. Yeah. Okay. Let me take a look at the time. Okay. I wanted to get to just kind of a review of when we think about the well, right? How is it maintained? What could be barriers to the maintenance of the well? How do you use caution in terms of spreading your kind of emotional resources? And then how do you conserve when you're feeling really depleted? So these are just some, I guess, representations of what might be included in each aspect as far as life balance, like the self-care wheel. And I can also send this to you all as well. And so, part of, again, the tracking is, for instance, if you devoted a lot of time around professional or perhaps spiritual, right? Where's the emotional, psychological, the personal time that you're spending, so that really the idea is that you're well-rounded, right? That it is not one area that is consuming all of the available time. Here's another depiction. And I think these are just all ways to figure out how how you can stay also connected to all aspects of who you are. So do you feel challenged intellectually, right? Do you feel challenged or find meaning spiritually, socially, physically? I think sometimes we might equate learning with intellectual stimulation, but I'm not quite sure that that is the best sort of equation, right? Because it depends on how you're engaging what is being taught, right? If it's just, okay, let me just memorize these concepts, or I can, repeat them, or are you, like it says, open to new ideas, thinking critically, being creative, and seeking out new challenges. Again, another way to depict how you might, it's almost like a series of calibrations, right? And so what is appealing to your heart, your spirit, your mind, your body? What are you thinking or doing or feeling that can help you sort of stay centered? Okay. And we've done that, but any thoughts about how many of you took a look at the final paper instructions? Oh. What did you say to yourself when you saw the instructions? A lot of work? Oh boy.
A lot of reflection.
What did you say?
A lot of reflection.
Okay. A lot of reflection is a good thing, right? And you have some, some pretty handy guiding questions. So these assessments also should be what you have to draw from, right? I think the only one you may not have is the stress scale. But if you'd like to do it, you can find that online. Okay. How many of you had an opportunity to read through Rest in the Storm? Okay. Not yet. Okay. Let me see. I might have to. I want to pull up the other slide. Okay. Okay. So this is actually what we had planned for Friday, and really kind of getting into Rest in the Storm. I really, really enjoyed kind of the metaphor and understanding the guiding questions that sort of began this book is, to what extent do caregivers, and this is in the introduction, to what extent do caregivers experience self-inflicted unnecessary suffering, right? Because I think sometimes we often say like, well, it is other people that are drawing from us, and that leaves us feeling burnt out or depleted. But how much of that sort of need do we manufacture because we want to feel important? And then how much of the leader's hurting may be attributed not to unavoidable costs of caring, but rather to unhealthy beliefs and behaviors regarding the essential relationships between personhood, vocation, recreation, and rest. And so here is when, where we want to pull together these aspects of what will, hopefully, you'll be able to use in developing a self-care plan along with your, kind of your story. Okay. So last year's class, I asked them, if you just completed the sentence, right, self-care is, these were some of the responses. And then, so how would you all finish that sentence? Self-care is. Anything come to mind?
I'd say essential. It's essential. Like you can't do the work unless you're doing self-care. Like it's counterproductive to think that you can keep giving without nurturing yourself, because then you're benefiting no one.
Right, right. So then if I asked, self-care is difficult because, what would you say? And that's a question for everyone.
Always put others first.
Okay.
Put ourselves last.
Okay. Difficult for any other reason?
It's difficult because I feel life feels like it's moving
Oh, you're
super
breaking
fast.
up a little bit, so just.
Can you hear me now? Oh, I can't even remember what I said. Talking about self-care is hard. Oh, because life feels like it's like moving super fast. I don't know. Sometimes when you think you're picking the priorities, you're picking, work or like understands that other people's needs and all those things. And it's hard to shift self-care into the same priority box as everything else that has been there for years and years.
Okay.
I would say self-care is hard because the balance is a moving target.
Okay. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Fatim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. How are you doing, Professor?
Good.
Forgive me for coming late, man. I was following your work, though, with the conference over the weekend.
Oh, alhamdulillah. So we're looking at the question of self-care, and if you had to finish the sentence, self-care is, and self-care is difficult because, what would you say?
I would say self-care is giving your body and soul its rights.
Okay.
And self-care is difficult because we're not taught to do that in this capacity of a spiritual care provider.
Okay. So when you say it's giving your body its rights, what do you mean? Break that down a little bit.
What I mean is that taking time for rest, for contemplation,
Okay.
for physical enjoyments. Yeah.
Okay. So these were the responses actually from last year's class. Self-care is difficult for me because I need to show initiative and a positive attitude and be a go-getter because I'm emotionally, physically, and financially exhausted. I haven't built a consistent habit of self-care. I am learning how to not have a narcissistic view of my job. I can't always afford it financially. I have limited time, and soon many things to do and doing it on my own. They also said, sometimes I wonder if I've done enough work to earn it. Does that resonate with anyone? Yeah.
Well, for me, my life before Islam was, I think I did, I caused some harm to people. And so I feel like I'm always trying to make up for that,
Okay. Okay.
So, and I don't think that, I've gotten to the place where I say we're even,
Oh, okay. So then you're going to have to think about, at what point do you feel like you've done enough penance?
Right.
Multiplies good by 10 and the bad only by 1.
Right. We should be okay, right? Unless it was me.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think one of the other responses, like, I don't know where to begin. Like, I think it sounds really almost like it goes without saying, right, that you need to care for yourself. But then when you're like, okay, well, now go do it, right, the question becomes like, what do I do? So really not knowing where to begin or how to do it consistently can be a challenge. And then this question of, when I ask for help, I risk. These were the responses from last year's class, risk being told no, disappointing people and appearing weak, risk judgment, losing face, feeling vulnerable, and maybe my self-care time isn't helpful. Also risk asking for something that others might think is too grandiose. I thought that was an interesting response. Feeling inadequate or incompetent, judgment from the self and from others. And then I asked, like, what is stressful about being a spiritual care leader or someone who's serving? And these were some of the responses. And do you notice the biggest word there in that word cloud?
Yes.
Right. And there's loneliness, but also alone. Does that resonate with any of you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What also stands out is this idea of feeling unappreciated, right? I see there's suffering, humility, pain, pressure, income, or maybe the lack thereof, demanding, like you also needing a lifeline and often not knowing where that lifeline is. But then I asked, well, what is hopeful, right? What do you look forward to about being in this position of a helper? And love, right, was one of the most frequent responses. Is there anything here that stands out, or how would you answer that question? What is hopeful about your role?
Community.
Say that one more time.
Community studies.
I'm hopeful that the work will bear fruit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to move through some of the concepts in this book, Rest in the Storm. It is 9:40. So how about we take a 10-minute break? And then when we come back, I'll get started at 9. Oh, well, my time, of course. It started around 9:50. And then we're going to move through some of the concepts and the overview of this book. How's that?
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Enrique. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. We were just on a short break. How are
Oh,
you?
okay.
I'm here.
I'm good. I'm a little confused with the time. I'm in Indonesia.
Oh, okay. What time is it for you?
Right now it's about 8:30,
8:51.
8:51.
In the morning?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
Wednesday morning.
Yes. So it is 9:51 Tuesday for me, PM, and 6:51. Okay. So we went through a review of sort of some of the barriers to asking for help, including, believing that no one will care or your need won't be met. You'll be judged as weak or incompetent. And so how at times those insecurities might actually get in the way of getting the support that you need. So wanted to explore some of the concepts that were raised in Rest in the Storm. And again, another book written from a Christian perspective, but I really appreciated some of the, or many of the concepts that that the author explores here, including, right, these are the questions, right? How much of the healer's hurting may be attributed not to unavoidable costs of caring, but rather to unhealthy beliefs and behaviors regarding the essential relationships between personhood, vocation, and recreation and rest. And are there alternative understandings and strategies that will allow clergy and other caregivers to minister and serve more frequently out of spiritual, psychological, emotional, and physical abundance and not scarcity? Okay. So he introduces this idea of confessing and confronting self-violence. And on page 12, he says self-violence is a form of neglect, particularly potent and prevalent because it is easy to camouflage and is socially acceptable to engage in sort of this practice of self-denial, right? Because then you're seen as like sacrificial. When people say like, oh, they'd give you the shirt off their back, right? And I'm like, so then that leaves you what, naked? Like, what is that? Right? But we applaud people for doing that. And so, yes, on one hand, we believe that, our Creator is the provider of all things. And, at times when people will say that person will give you the shirt off their back, they'll give you, whatever you need. My thought is always, is that being done to fulfill some other need or to avoid what may be some concerns in that person's life? Because the recognition for being that kind of sacrificial person is also really, really compelling, yes. Right? It becomes part of your identity. Rustin, you were going to, somebody started to speak.
I was, maybe it was me mumbling.
Okay.
But I was thinking years ago, maybe early on in the 90s, I used to do just that, give away everything somebody saw and liked, And then I remember when it became such a burden because I was known to be that person, even when I didn't want to give away stuff, So I felt kind of imprisoned by that, what I used to do out of the goodness of my heart.
Right. And some people take that almost as like a mandate, right? Yeah. That if somebody compliments you on something, you should give it to them.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure where that belief kind of stemmed from, but I definitely remember my mother in particular being that kind of person, right? And so I think what began to happen is like, she was like, I'm just going to wear stuff that nobody's going to want. Because that way, I don't have to give it away. But he, when he talks about this self-violence, he describes it on page 12 as the rush and pressure of modern life, right, is a form of violence, but also to allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything is to succumb to violence. The frenzy, and he says in particular with activists, or people who are givers in a certain way, the frenzy, right, of that work neutralizes your work for peace, right? It destroys our inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fulfillment of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom, which makes work fruitful. And by that is meaning you're getting so caught up in the many things you have to do, right, that the being able to be present, right, for just the pleasure of the moment or the people that you're with, the company that you have, when it starts to become a burden, then you really lose out on some of the blessings, right? You may be known as the person who, gives and provides, right, again, without limit. But if in your mind, you're thinking like, I wish these people go away, right? Like how are you sort of compromising the integrity of what you're doing when what you're actually wishing for is to be so far removed from it? Any thoughts about that? I heard a voice, but I don't know if I was hearing someone. Was that you, Sundus? No? Okay. And then page 15 to 17, he talks about the cheers from within and without. So this idea of achievement, adrenaline, and affirmation from others. Let me find this. Okay. And then obstructions to actually admitting where you sort of wronged yourself by not, giving yourself the opportunity to rest and to be present, to recuperate. He says that what gets in the way of that is a lack of personal accountability. And so what he writes is that acknowledgement of personal responsibility does not just lend the humility and integrity needed in order to assess other shortcomings. It is the prerequisite step to the spiritual and emotional healing process. As long as we are cut off from our own personal maladies, whether through benign ignorance or conscious denial, we ensure that healing never takes place. Okay, and says many helpers, again, this is page 18, tend to resist identifying and exposing the weak places lurking inside of us. For some of us, admitting to being vulnerable to the personal affliction of self-violence undermines our image of the minister as the mighty bulwark. But if we can first begin by holding ourselves accountable, then it's much easier to sit with people who are also seeking ways of being more responsible. The next being a spirit of ecclesial competition. Another impediment to acknowledging our own self-violence is this. We want to keep this reality quiet, hidden, of course, but most of us want our ministries to manifest the growth and vibrancy of, perhaps what we see of other, and here I'm paraphrasing, what we see of other organizations, right? And so maybe we're performing or behaving in a certain way because we're really in competition with others, right? I want to be known as the person that is most patient. I want to be known as the person who, will be of most service, right? So here there's some conflict between intention and balance that is needed. And then lastly, this denial of personhood is what Jones calls the most common, potent, and disastrous form of self-violence. And that is, it says, in order to genuinely own up to the effects of personal neglect, we must first own up to our reality as a person. The tragic and pervasive problem of ministry is that along the pathway of service to others, many well-meaning ministerial aspirants forget who they are apart from any religious activity, right? And I just broaden this to in whatever role you're serving, do you forget that you're also a flawed human being, right? Sometimes, we might move quickly to this idea that we can save others, and then we forget that we are also really as, susceptible, right, to those flaws and imperfections as anyone else. Okay, so what Jones, how he extends this metaphor, right, is how do we get to the back of the boat? Okay, how do we say, yes, I can still lead, but I might not be the person that has to be at the forefront, right? How do I lead from behind? How do I ensure that other people also have the opportunity to demonstrate their gifts and capabilities? Okay. Those of you who have read this chapter, any thoughts?
For me, that's where I kind of got lost in the writing.
Okay.
I wasn't sure about what it meant to go to the back of the boat. I saw the metaphor, but it wasn't clear enough.
It wasn't clear enough. Okay. Did others feel that way as well?
Now you speaking in terms of the Jesus going to the back of the boat and resting, right?
Right.
Yes.
So what I got from that was just they was demonstrating that he was taking care of himself. That's what I got from that. There was more of the self-care. But it's an interesting thing. When I was reading this, one of the things that kept popping out in my mind is relating it to reading other works of like scholars, people that begin their work saying this is from the person who is poor and in the need of God's mercy and grace and all that before in their introductions, just to remind themselves, and so I was identifying with that need to remind yourself and be self-aware that you as broken as, in some cases, you're broken and you need the help, and we have to do that every day. But it also made me realize how important the maintenance of our, of our own spiritual life is. And I mean, what I mean by that is just our own rituals, making prayer 5 times a day, fasting, and sometimes, doing the different things, giving in charity, just being conscious of our, of our spiritual development and the need for blessings from God, is just, that's what it told me, because otherwise you can get lost. And I've been on that side, working as an imam, it's easy because you got, when you have multiple people that can have your home number or your cell number, that they take liberties, and they, especially after you have a relationship with them,
Right. So on page 20, I mean, I think it's worth fleshing this out, because I think the metaphor is pretty powerful. So what he says on page 26 is that the back of the boat is a metaphor, a symbol of the necessary break from the activism of life in general and the rigors of ministry in particular. The back of the boat is not a luxury. Time spent in the back of the boat is not optional if our intention is to lead a healthy, balanced, and productive life. It is the back of the boat time, the off time, that makes you being sort of at the front of the boat possible. And so he says, Richard Swenson would say that when Jesus went to the back of the boat, he was practicing margin. And margin is the space that once existed between our load and our limits, right? Margin is the space between vitality and exhaustion. It is our breathing room, our reserves, our leeway. It is the opposite of overload, right? And so it essentially goes back to the idea of, do we know what our balance is, right? We said we constantly, earlier in the session, you know, what I said is that it's similar to when you're driving, right? You're not just going in a straight line for an hour, right? Sometimes you tend to drift a little to the left or to the right, and then you correct, right? Maybe you're listening to something and then it's loud, and so you turn it down. And so you're constantly making these adjustments to your driving, even as you're moving forward. But what he talks about is the blockades, the blockades to being in the back of the boat. So essentially, when do you take time to say, you know, one, do you trust in the people around you, right, to continue to operate without falling apart, right? Do you allow yourself moments to recuperate, and having to, in the process, rely on other people, right, to make sure you can continue to move forward. So these are the three, what Jones calls blockades, right, to giving yourself permission to kind of move to the rear, right, to giving yourself permission to recuperate. And the first, he says, is the delusion is the myth of our own indispensability, right? And who wants to tell me what they glean from that as a barrier?
Can you say it again?
He said the myth of our own indispensability, right? And so he goes on to say, in order for us to embrace the time we need and deserve to rest and refuel, we must believe the unbelievable, the preposterous, and the absurd, namely, that life will go along just fine during our temporary retreats. Right? If we believe as soon as I stop helping or being present, everything will fall apart, right? I don't know how many of us walk around thinking this consciously, but certainly on some level, right? The idea is, if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it, and everything is just going to fall to pieces.
I think, unfortunately, this is one of the biggest problem of our current 21st century, like presidencies all around the world. that's little like, especially like in Turkey, that was one of the case that, you know, if I leave, all countries gonna go down, kind of thing. So that's, I think, one of the sickness at the end. But jokes aside, half jokes. I see that a lot of time in my workplaces or chaplaincy when I was doing in the hospital. We often fall into this section. It happened to me many times. I feel like, okay, you know, I'm in the middle of something, and you know, I'm doing this good, and if I don't do it, you know, it's gonna just go bad. But it's not the case all the time, but it's just so hard to remove yourself from that thoughts.
Right. And, you know, I learned this lesson, honestly. And if Muhammad, you're still there, you were present for all of the work at the conference. And there were so many times that I had to tell myself, right, that there were a team of people who wanted to help. Now, were there, again, adjustments that we had to make along the way? For sure. But being able to accept, right, that perhaps something won't get done in your exact specifications, right, but it'll get done, right? And is that not the goal, right? And so what Jones says in Rest in the Storm is often it is when we move out of the picture that we allow for the necessary leadership shifts and decision-making to take place in our various ministry settings. Believing ourselves to be an essential, indispensable element of a program or institution is a terrible liability and an outright lie. Okay? The layered liability is egoism and overload as we try to live up to the demands of inflated importance. Okay, that's like quite a read right there, right? He says it's overinflated importance. The lie, and he says an idolatrous one at that, is to bow down to the God of personal irreplaceability. Although none of us are replaceable as unique persons, each of us is replaceable with regard to our job or vocation. Okay. Many of us more so than we could ever stand to admit. To get to the back of the boat with greater frequency and faithfulness, we must confess our belief in the myth of personal indispensability and then shake loose of it. Okay, but this is not an easy task. Was it you, Fatin, that said there was someone in your family, maybe it was a mom or auntie that said, if people will find a way to replace you?
Yes, that was me. My mother used to say, if you drop dead today, it'll be somebody else. So she would often tell me, stop and take some rest. But you know, the part of the dilemma is that people sometimes reinforce that false perception that you have of yourself as indispensable.
Sure.
You know, in you know, in our community, people have often said, "What will we do if something happens to you?" You know? And so you, as much as you have that self-talk about, I know it's going to get done. It was getting done before I got here, and it'll continue. You know, you hear that, and you're impacted by it in subtle ways. You know, so it make you, I think, feel a certain responsibility to work more. You know. Yeah.
So in what way, let me ask you this, in what way does it reinforce that belief? Because you can always say, well, if something were to happen to me, you know, Allah knows best, right? And his plan.
Yes.
But if something were to happen to me, I trust that you would be able to take care of yourselves.
Yes. You know, while saying that, you know, often, and even proving it, I left this city for about a year to do some studying in 2010. You know, you still feel this kind of need to keep busy, and you may just overdo it because of that, you know, whatever people say about you. You know.
Well, so now that would lead me to wonder whether you've built your sense of self or self-esteem, right?
Right.
Around that feeling of being indispensable.
Probably.
Right.
Probably you know, in subtle ways, not intentionally for sure. But in subtle ways, you know, we entered into the work looking to be useful.
Yes.
And when that usefulness is validated, you know, it's like an intoxicant at some level. You keep working for, you know, towards that, I think. And again, I would say unconsciously, but definitely it happens.
Yes.
Regularly.
And that I think that unconscious or that subconscious is approval.
Yeah.
Right? Is validation.
Yeah.
Is, you know, wanting to be told that you're a good person.
Right.
Right. And so, you know, part of it, so there might be some element of truth, right? That you might be the most skilled person or you might be the most capable. But then your task is to determine whether or not you've done enough to make others around you as capable.
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes.
You know, I want to interject something, just a story.
Yes.
I have a good friend, Abdul Rauf. I don't know if you know him. He actually a graduate of Ben. He, when you know, he was like a mentor to me, and I he had a class at that time. It was just a prayer class, and I learned the prayer, and I could say my English and Arabic, but I continued to go to the class because it was really more than just he would teach prayer. So we made, while we were on Hajj, he told me, say, you know, when we get back, you can teach the prayer class, and I'm going to start an Arabic class.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, he just kind of put that on me, and I thought to myself, I said, now, can I? He said, you know the prayer, so you just teach, you know. And so I started teaching at that point. Later,
All right, Brother Enrique, you want out?
no, I'm saying, okay.
Okay, there you go.
What I was saying is he the same thing he did to me, he did to several students, and one of them was Imam Fahim Shuaib. I mean, he mentored him when he first. So he, you know, he continuously does this
Okay.
with students, and you know, and it's a good example of getting out of the way. He's very, you know, he's very unassuming. You wouldn't even expect that he has as much impact as he has on a community, but he's trained a lot of the leaders of in Northern California. A lot of, you know.
Wow. And that is, I think, in some ways, like the antidote to this idea of indispensability, right? Like I have this sort of unique, irreplaceable, special, you know, yes, everyone has gifts, but if you're not also working, like how will that gift have the most impact, right? If you're not also in some ways enlisting others in understanding what that role means and helping them, you know, perhaps gain an appreciation for what they're also capable of doing, right? So
one of the things that caught me that was the fact that when you try to do everything, then you block the way of somebody else that could come and make a big contribution to help you, you know, to help the effort, whatever you know, your efforts that you're trying to do, you know. So
absolutely.
Being reminded
Yes.
of a couple of occasions in the Quran where Allah tells the companions and the people around the Prophet this very thing, right? That whenever Allah wants, He could replace you with another people.
Wow. Yes.
Some of them started, and when
Yes.
some people developed this idea that, you know, they were irreplaceable and that things wouldn't happen without them.
Right.
Very much an impotent idea.
Yes. 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 So related to that is, you know, what he calls the second barrier on page 32 of invincibility, right? The second delusion that may keep us from making it to the back of the boat is this myth. Deep down within, a great many of us feel that we have limitless reserves of compassion and energy, right? It is not that we completely ignore the signs of fatigue and exhaustion, but we condition ourselves to rest only as we are near the breaking point. And even then, just long enough to feel, he says, the first pulsations of renewed energy. The result is a life always on the brink of fatigue, right? Or even more tragic, an early death resulting from cumulative stress and tension. And so he feels that contributing to the sense of invincibility is this idea of adrenaline, achievement, and affirmation, right? And so this need to achieve and to be affirmed by others, and that almost kind of being, you know, where we feel like where we get our we get energy from other people, right? We feel this rush when we are able to kind of move in and, fix things and set things right. And that can become intoxicating, I think is one, Fatina, I think it was you that said that. This is a third factor that contributes to our sense of invisibility is our perceived proximity to God. It is possible, with no small assistance from some congregants, for ministers to think of ourselves as sort of like, he said, God juniors, right? As opposed to the limited servants of God that we are. And so if you think of yourself as a superman, superwoman, you discover that many persons around us will offer, will begin to treat you in a certain way, right? And that being also something that's very compelling. And then the last thing is the great denial of our own personhood. And that's related to some of the symptoms of emotionally unhealthy spirituality. Covering over brokenness, not being willing to admit that we have our own limitations and that we cannot do everything for everyone. So any thoughts or reflections, comments?
Well, I think that Enrique and a few other folks that talked about this, but maybe not explicitly in this way. And that was just this idea of enabling others, whether you want to look at it in a good way or a bad way. So the good way sort of is, or the not so great way is when you're always there, you're not giving someone else an opportunity to step up and know what strength they have within themselves. And that's really a disservice to that person.
Right.
So I think it was mentioned, but not quite in that way. That was like the resounding message from listening to everyone.
Yes.
That's it here.
That is good.
I just want to say that the whole myth of your own indispensability for me was driven in as early as I could remember. I remember being an immigrant and having my parents tell me, okay, you go to school, make sure the teacher knows who you are. Make sure that you're not left behind. Make sure that you're seen. And then even there was a movement at some point in the productivity world where you have to make yourself indispensable, so that your employer knows you and that you secure your position in the company.
That's why I said we got here early.
Sorry, 1 second. I'm sorry. Well, if you're not speaking, can you please mute your mic? Because there's some interference.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, those kind of reinforcements for over decades makes it so hard to now break down.
Yes.
So that I find that to be particularly challenging for me, even though I'm a Buddhist and I have I've been trained to not recognize the self in relation to the rest of the world. The truth of the matter is you build up habits for so long that
yes.
that is you can't undo it overnight. It's taken decades to build up, and it's going to take years to break down.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. And I think the approach that has helped me with, slowly incorporating some of these ideas into my own practice has been really to treat myself with kindness, right? And that there is some degree of validation that we're seeking, of recognition, even if it's not like to be center stage, but, just that idea of somebody, right? Like I really appreciate that. So again, trying to find the balance between when is my service self-serving, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to keep in mind. When is my service self-serving? Because that will be one of the ways that we turn self-care into, right, maybe it's like time away from me being able to get my needs met, right, through the people that I serve, right? And so if that is the thinking, then your intention is not going to be quite aligned where it needs to be, right? And so when you, if again, the adjustments. So if it feels like I want to serve in this way because I will, I will feel indispensable. I will feel irreplaceable. I love the feeling of somebody saying like, that is such a selfless, sacrificial human being. They're always there for others, right? If that's kind of what you're starting to build your identity on and you need that, then there's going to be compromises that you make, right? For your self-care, there'll be compromises that you make in your relationships with others because that need for that kind of validation will overwhelm, right, the purity of your intention.
Right.
So.
And I think I recognize some of that, which is why I'd love to hear your feedback on this, which is why it's so important to have people who can be honest enough to tell you those things.
Exactly.
Like and it goes back to my particular situation where I'm so solitary that I don't know if I have that person to tell me what my blinds are.
Yeah. And that person will also be able to kind of gently tell you like, things are going to be okay if you don't do it, right? Like that it is not that you are sort of, you can be discarded, right? It doesn't go to that extreme. But if you constantly feel like, well, I have to be the center, right, spoke of this wheel, right, then what other sort of ego needs are being gratified? Right. And one way that I've tried to sort of test this or kind of challenge myself, at one point, people would contact me and they'd want to either, it could be for a piece that they're writing, they're a reporter, or someone inviting me to speak. And at first I would say, well, I have to say yes, right? I have to be available. And then I would say, well, no, I know someone who is equally capable and probably has more time, right? And so let me refer that person. Or if I'm being invited to participate in a certain gathering and it would require so much maneuvering on my part even to make it happen, I've started to say, you know what, I would really love to be there, but unfortunately I can't. But here's someone that I believe would be, great to be included, and might have the availability, right? And so at first I was like, oh no, I'm missing out, right? I want to say yes. And then I realized, like, one, I felt so much better just setting the boundary. And for the other person who might be able to take advantage of the opportunity, they were also very appreciative, right? And so there's a way of, I think, moving away from that myth of your own indispensability is actually an opportunity to create community, right? Because then you can say like, oh, wow, I had no idea you were so, skilled in this area. And here's someone that, might need that expertise or is looking for it. And now I can match the two of you, right? I can kind of get out of the way, right? And I think that is the beauty of learning, that when you can sort of teach with the goal of being replaced, or that you think about succession planning, like who could I tap, right, to fill my shoes if I haven't prepared anyone, if I haven't allowed anyone, I've kind of created this sort of mystification around what I do, so people think it's magic, or have I been very transparent about, what my role entails, and I'm willing to kind of induct more people into that process. So we're gonna stop here, but what I want you all to think about is which one of these three, and you don't have to write or, nothing like that, but just think kind of in your own life, if you reflect on it, which one of those three barriers tends to be the strongest, right? Obstacle in your life to getting to self-care. Okay. So before we end the call, any final comments or thoughts? No?
So we could talk about the reflective paper.
Which one?
The what was it? Day in Your Life? Is that the one?
Oh, the shape of your daily life?
Shape of your daily life, yeah.
Okay. Are there questions about that?
For me, question centers around what you're looking for, besides what was in the instructions. Is there more to what you're looking for than the literal, like 4-page paper, and talk about what patterns you see? Are there concepts that you're looking for that we should be expounding on?
Not necessarily concepts that I'm looking for, but I would hope that in, let's see, that was page. Okay. So what it asks you to do says look at your activities, put a plus sign next to each activity that boosts your energy, a minus next to the activities that drain you. So I would hope that as you track your daily activities, you kind of categorize them in that way, that you're able to, through your reflection on that week of documenting, that you can also relate it to, say the metaphor of the well, or emotionally unhealthy spirituality. And so what do you see reflected in your daily activities that also resonates with the material, right? With the content and the concepts that we've been talking about.
Okay, so can I jump in with the question? Please forgive me if I haven't seen the resources, but have the PowerPoints been shared?
I will check. You should
that would be really helpful. And even though I've read like 2 or 3 of the books, and skimmed 1 or 2 maybe, I think just having the PowerPoints and those themes that come out from each book and being able to go back and refer will really help tie those things together for that reflection paper, for me at least.
Okay. I'll make sure those go up. I just have to check. They're pretty large files, so I'll just have to check to see the most efficient way of loading them. But I can do that. Don't worry about that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay. If you do, feel free to send me an email. Again, if you post your message through the portal, just click, that the copy will be sent via email, because I'm not always on the portal, but I get the email immediately. Okay. So our next meeting will be on Monday. And same time, 5:30 to 7:30 Pacific time, 8:30 East Coast. Okay. But in between, if you have a question or, pardon, the 29th.
Because we got theories and practices scheduled at, Manir was supposed to let you know that was scheduled prior to this. That was scheduled at 5 o'clock.
Theories. So it's the second, you're saying it's the second course?
Yes, the second course that we have, the 29th for Tahara. Tahara had that scheduled with her original classes.
Okay, I see.
Can we do next Tuesday?
Okay, yeah, so let's do that. And I'll send out a message that we'll go ahead and just move that to next Tuesday,
Okay.
the 30th.
That works.
Okay.
Yes.
And again, in the meantime, if you have any other question or you're writing it up and you're not quite sure, I wonder if this is, if I'm taking this in the right direction, just feel free to reach out. Okay. Thank you all for joining and for your attention. I'm looking forward to picking back up. Again, we'll be here, the Sacred Pace. Okay. All right. Well, have a good evening and have a good rest of your week. Inshallah.